Welcome to podcast number 67 for Thanks for Your Service. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. Our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net and you can email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. One of the great experiences of doing these podcasts is coming across remnants of Australian military history that not a lot of people know about. Who knew that Ballarat in Victoria played a major role in training RAAF personnel during World War II? Peter and Janet joins us from the Air Force Association Ballarat to tell us more.
It was a couple of months ago that I was fortunate to visit you folks on a cold Ballarat winter's day at the Ballarat airfield, and I found out about this World War II training establishment that I never knew existed. What was that?
Wireless Air Gunner School was set up early 1940 at Ballarat, because Ballarat was an existing RAAF airfield, and the initial commanding officer, Fairbairn, his brother was the then Minister for Air. So we feel that there's probably one of the reasons that it was set up here in Ballarat was as a result of the Fairbairn family. So at the start of the Second World War, the Brits wanted the Dominions, as they called them in those days. They wanted Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Rhodesia, at that stage, as it was called, to supply aircrew. And the Empire Air Training Scheme was set up, and they basically what they wanted was for the RAAF, the RAF, they could train up to 50,000 aircrew annually, and they wanted Australia to provide up to 28,000 of those aircrew, and the Wireless Air Gunner was part of that.
One WAGS was part of a training scheme across Australia. So there were a couple of...
Yes, there was number 2 WAGS was in Parkes, New South Wales, and number 3 was in Maryborough, Queensland. But Ballarat was the first wireless air gunner school to be established in 1940. Only the wireless component of the training was done in Ballarat. The gunner part was done in Port Pirie, South Australia, Evans Head, New South Wales, and mostly Sale in Victoria. So that Ballarat was deemed to be not safe as a community for the gunning part of the course. So they were sent out to those bases because they could go out over the sea and have their crack gunnery practice doing that. So there were 57 wireless courses and 12 navigator courses held over the 5 years at Ballarat.
You mentioned before that Ballarat was an existing RAAF airbase. So was that the reason that one WAGS was chosen, as Ballarat was chosen to be the location for one WAGS?
Well, we believe it was probably influenced by the Fairbairns. They apparently originally owned the land, which was then sold to the RAAF, and the base was formed here. And as I mentioned before, Fairbairn was the commanding officer from 1940, so he set the whole thing up, and he was commanding officer from 1940 to late 1944, and his brother was the Minister for Air. So we just feel that that was one of the reasons. Also, Ballarat was a large town even back then, and a lot of industry here. Ballarat has been a large centre of industry. There's a lot of trains built here back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So it was very much an established area for industry.
And early on in the early 1914 time, Ballarat had an existing airport, and we had the first flying school in Australia. So there was the history there. The first one WAGs didn't start at the aerodrome. It actually started at the showgrounds in Ballarat, and the first 80 trainees were sent there, and they were in tents, as you can imagine what it would have been like in winter. And they came from all over Australia, the trainees from all walks of life. So they started there, and then every month another 80 trainees were taken into the base to be trained, and eventually it just got too big, and so they went out to the airport, and that's when they started building all their huts and the infrastructure out there.
Can you give us an idea or an overview of the actual training that was conducted at One WAG? So from a student coming into Ballarat, how long did they train for, and what did the training course look like?
Well, they were here for approximately 6 months, and they had to learn Morse code, learn to operate radios. They then went into aircraft. So they then used aircraft, DC-3s, the Avro Ansons, to actually operate the radio, etc. And what's interesting is the degree of proficiency was they were doing in 6 months what was taking normally 2 years to do. So they pushed people through very quickly. And then with the pilots that were trained under the Empire scheme, they then went to Canada for their final training because it was close to UK. And the Australians basically were spread, well, to start off with, they went to Europe. My father, for example, went over in 1940-41. He did course number 6 here. And Janet's father also did the wireless air gunners course here. And hence, a lot of our interest has come out of knowing that they were here. So then they went across, and they would predominantly went into RAAF squadrons in Europe. The only 2 real Australian squadrons were 10 and 461, and they were the Sunderland squadrons, so the flying boat squadrons. 10 was formed before the war, and they went over to pick up Sunderland aircraft. The war broke out, and they were the first Australians into the Second World War. So, for example, on a Sunderland, there would be at least 2 wireless air gunners. Your Catalinas, at least 1 wireless air gunner, and then on all your bombers had wireless air gunners, and they would vary depending on the size of the plane as to how many wireless air gunners were on. So the larger bombers would have probably also had the 2.
From memory, it was your father in one of those squadrons who flew in one of those squadrons. Is that correct?
Yeah, he was in 10. He was in 10 squadrons. So he went over, he did course number 6 in 1940, and he went across to the UK, would have been late 41 that he got there. And he went straight into 10 squadron. He came back in late 1944 as an instructing officer and was here until he was demobbed in March 1946. So he was, and what's interesting is the premises that we occupy is the original officers' mess. So it's quite funny walking around the building. Knowing my father walked around there nearly 80 years ago.
Incredible, isn't it? Yeah. I think you talked before about the infrastructure that was needed for the base at Ballarat Airfield. Can you give us an idea at the height of the training during the war? How big was the base, and what did it actually consist of?
There were over 160 what they call P huts. So these were the huts that were used both for training, messes, and living. Then there was gymnasium and various other buildings that were used for maintenance, storage, and there were 4 hangars, which are still here, the Bellman hangars on the base. So it was very extensive, and there's about 40 of the original sheds, P sheds, in existence, of which Hut 48, where the Air Force Association is, and the 4 hangars are still here. So being an RAAF base, there was a lot of infrastructure left because it was an operational base until the mid-60s.
It's what struck me in terms of our visit to you this year is it's actually surprising of how much the base actually still exists. I mean, obviously, where you are, it's been renovated, but there's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of evidence of the base. And what got me was the size of it.
Yes, yeah. Well, there were a total of just over 6,000 crew went through the training, and you got to look at all the support people. You had chefs, you had all your secretarial staff, they had shoemakers, they had boilermakers, they had, you name it, and they had it here. So it was a fully operational community. There would have been, at any one time, there's a possibility of what being...
About 2,000 people on the base at one time. Like in 1943, they had, that was the peak of the training, they had 70 officers, 2 nurses, 109 WAFs, 1,568 airmen, plus all the ground staff, and then the planes consisted of Wackets, Avro Ansons, and so on. So it actually had a railway line that went out to the base, and that's how they transported a lot of their goods, and the trainees came backward and forward on the trains. So it was like a satellite city, really, in its day out there. And when you think over 6,000 people went through in the 5 years, so it was a very important part of World War II in supporting Britain against their fight. And then later, of course, our airmen were then deployed to the Pacific once Japan came into the fray. So,
when we were being given a tour of the base, I believe that there were American bombers also based there. Is that right?
The Americans used Ballarat as a recreational base, and the Victoria Gardens are... there's a very large American base there, and there were bombers that came in and out for training purposes. And in fact, G for George, the Liberator that's in the museum in Canberra, actually came up here to raise. They did a fundraising day where they took people for flights, and that was very popular. But yes, the Americans were here, but they were on what's R&R. They weren't actually being trained here. It was purely for R&R.
And I remember you saying that a one WAG graduate also had links with the famous dam buster raids. Who was he?
Frederick Spafford. So he did the one WAG's Course 6, and then he went to gunnery at Evans Head. He was posted to England, and he completed some 30 operations with the RAAF 50 Squadron, and he received the Distinguished Flying Medal for his skill and praiseworthy example. He was commissioned in January 43. In March, he was invited to join the elite 617 Squadron, which was formed to do the bombing of the dams in the Rua and Vesa valleys. So he was actually the wing commander. Guy Gibson made the comment of Spafford that he was acclaimed as a bomb aimer, and so he did the course, and unfortunately didn't come home.
No, on a following raid that was similar to the dam busters, he went out again and was shot down, and they were killed. So he was only 25 years old when he was killed. So, but he was portrayed in the movie The Dam Busters by an actor, and had the darker RAAF uniform on, and wore his cap on the side. A very, from all accounts, a great character and a fantastic bomb aimer.
Can people actually visit the base?
Yes. One of the things that is happening currently, certainly by ourselves, is to encourage people to come. We had the Friends of Museum from Point Cook up the end of July. It was about 45 people came through the base. We've done similar things with other organisations. So, the biggest issue we have, interestingly, I did an address at the Mechanics Institute a few months back, and people that live in Ballarat are really unaware that there's really even an airport there, and what's operational, how it's operational. They've just extended the runway, and we know that RECs are interested in being involved in services. We'll see what happens with that, but the revenue from the airport is something like about $10 million a year into the Ballarat economy. So there's a lot of car clubs there. There's a lot, the people that occupy the building with us, the engine people, they're running a field day shortly in October. And so that's once again encouraging people to come and visit. So, and we'd welcome people if they've got in touch with us. We'd love to have people there.
So we've got 2 museums out at the airport. One's the Aviation Museum that's run by the Aero Club out there. And the other one is the Avro Anson Museum, which is in the old gymnasium, which used to be the One Wags gymnasium for the trainees. So there are things to see out at the airport that are of interest for aviation enthusiasts and so on. So,
can you also tell us a little bit about yourselves, about the Ballarat Air Force Association?
Yeah, it was started back in 46, and its purpose was to bring together returned service people. It has developed, obviously, the people that came back from the war. Unfortunately, there aren't any alive. They've all passed on. And so now it's basically we're the sons and daughters of the people that went through and or ex-Air Force people. We've got people that were in Vietnam. We've got people that have been in recent places around the world with the RAAF. So we're really encouraging people. We run functions every second Tuesday. We have a luncheon. We run theatre days. We try to be involved with the other organisations out there. Like a lot of organisations, our biggest issue is getting members, and that's across the board. It doesn't matter whether it's the RSL, Legacy, ourselves. It's an issue, but we'd love to have any visitors out we can.
Now, you've also got an extensive website for One Wags. Where can people find that? What's the web address?
the web address is onewags.org.au, all lowercase. On that website, there are over 6,000 names where people can do a search on the homepage if they're looking for a father, grandfather, etc. If they're there, that will take them to a profile page which lists the service records of that airman. We also have a memorial section because 1,182 trainees from Ballarat were killed. So we have a section dedicated to them with a lot more information about how they were killed, what squadrons they were in, prisoners of war status, gallantry citations. It's a very in-depth look at those people who were killed, and also quite intensive descriptions of the base, the history, what the courses were all about, both the wireless component and the gunnery section that was held off the base. So yes, it's we've had just recently over 100,000 individual browsers. So we're celebrating that on the homepage because we feel that's quite an achievement in 3 years to have.
Also come in that one of the things that Janet does each couple of months is a special story on one of the people. So 12 months or so ago, she had to do one on my father, but she's done. We've had families that have from the website have actually come and joined us. We had one family do a presentation on their father. So that's also part of it, that we encourage people to contact us if they've got information, and we're more than happy to do stories on people.
One WAGS was established through the Empire Air Training Scheme. What was that?
The Empire Air Training Scheme was set up by Great Britain, and they came to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Rhodesia, as it was then called, and asked for contributions into supplying crew. The factories in England were capable of building the quantities of aircraft, but they were not capable of producing the numbers of aircrew required. So Australia made a commitment to supply about 27,000 aircrew. And of those, 6,000 plus were wireless air gunner. So the others were pilots, obviously navigators, mechanics, etc. So it was when you think of the population of Australia at the time, it was a huge request. And it actually got to the stage in 1944 where the wireless componentry of the program started to wind back, because we had done our job. And as had New Zealand, as had done Canada. I mentioned before about the squadrons that went to the UK, the two Australian. There's also a New Zealand squadron went across with Sunderlands. There was a Canadian squadron went across with Sunderlands. So our contributions, when you think back to the populations that we had, were just huge.
Part of the agreement, the Empire Air Training Scheme, was that what Australia wanted was that the crews were to form into RAAF squadrons. And so some of those were formed, but on the whole, most of the aircrew that went over through the scheme ended up in RAF squadrons and served in Bomber Command, Coastal Command, Fighter Command, and so on. And just as a little side, of the 28,000 that Australia supplied, 486 lost their lives. So more than half of the total of all RAAF personnel killed in action, and almost 20% of all Australian combat deaths in World War II. So even though we were supplying these enormous amounts of aircrew, they knew when they got there that 1 in 3 weren't going to come home. So the rate of deaths was enormous. And so these young 19, 20, 21-year-olds were so brave, in our opinion. And so
I actually had an uncle, Dad's older brother, who was a pilot in 461 Squadron, and he was the first pilot in a major incident in June 43, and where they survived an attack by 8 Ju-88s and limped home into crash landed Prasands in Cornwall. 13 weeks later, he had his own plane and he was shot down, and so he didn't come home. So it, and unfortunately, with the Sunderland people, it's a bit like the bomber people. Most of the bodies were, well, in the Sunderland case, the bodies weren't found, and most in the cases of the bomber command, the same thing.
Thank you so much again for your time.
That's the podcast for today. The website for One WAGS is www.onewags.org.au. We're keen to hear your feedback by leaving a review on your podcast app, because your reviews helps new listeners find our podcast. You can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website and Facebook page, and your support helps us with the production of this podcast. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your service.